welcome to today's session. To have a more comprehensive and critical understanding of Edward Albee's play, The Zoo Story, we'll also look at this essay which talks about the elements of symbolism and naturalism in the play. So, as we discussed in one of the earlier sessions at the outset of the course, the American drama in the 20th century began experimenting with various features, including uh, naturalism and symbolism, and those were all very neatly fitted within the realist genre, within the realist technique of the storytelling. So this is an essay by Zimbardo, which begins by arguing that some of those elements look very forced, particularly in the early plays. But however, their self-consciousness seems to be disappearing when it comes to Edward Albee's play, and he's also seen as the finest. This play is also seen as one of the finest American plays where the naturalist and the symbolist elements have come to coexist, which is why, as per the critical opinion, this is also a play which fits in perfectly with the absurdist tradition of the which dominated the European theatre as well. So this in this play we find that the level of symbolism, the elements of symbolism, they act at various levels. Given that this is a one-act play, and that most of these most of the play is also about the dialogue and the symbols which emerge through words. There is a way in which this blending of symbolism and naturalism it gives a lot to the theme as well, because there are very few actions in terms of movement. It all happens in one single setting, but the play of course takes us back and forth through the many memories of Jerry, particularly when he's talking about his family and certain episodes in his life, the one that features the dog. And before we get into those details, we find that the right from the title, the zoo itself emerges as a very symbolic element. It's a symbolic site. So to look at some of the aspects of the play, which this essay also neatly foregrounds, and also the objective behind looking at this essay is also to get used to a certain critical way in which a critical vocabulary with which you could begin to look at these plays, and to be familiar with the organization of these different themes and the organization of arguments within the structure of an academic paper. So here it says, on the simplest level, the zoo story is concerned with human isolation. Yeah? And this is something which is very evident from the outset of the play and in every single strand of conversation that we identify between Jerry and Peter. There is a world of isolation that both of them inhabit in two different ways. One more visible, one is more vocal. One is the isolation in one is of a more tragic nature than the other, but at the heart of it, one could say that it's entirely about human isolation within the social setting, social political and cultural setting of 1950s America. So the world itself is seen as a zoo, to quote from the play itself, with everyone separated by bars from everyone else, the animals for the most part from each other, and always the people from the animals. The zoo symbol is used particularly for this compartmentalization. It is seemingly one single space, the zoo, one single site, but the compartmentalization operates at different layers within it, which is what happens in the social stratification, which divides the class divide, the economic divide, and the worlds of the difference of value system which separates Jerry's world from that of Peter's. So that is, men are not only separated from each other, but from their own basic animal natures, as Peter, one of the people, is, until at the end of the play, separated from his own animal nature. So this segregation, just the way we will find it in the physical site of a zoo, it's quite evident in the interplay of these two characters. When they encounter, we find that the division is not just between these two individuals and the worlds that they inhabit, but in the case of Peter particularly, there is a world within, there's a divided life within him, there's a divided world within him, which he, a part of it he always engages with only through in terms of denial. There is an animal instinct, there is a world which wants to open up and be free like Jerry, but who's acutely isolated, just like Jerry. But there is a certain surface, a very superficial, protective, seemingly protective layer, under which he is burying everything. So the play opens up on Peter, who's seated on a bench in the park, as Albee tells us in his description. So please go back to the first sections of the play where these descriptions are given in detail. Both these personalities are described. So both of these people, even Peter, he's not a distinctive sort of a gentleman. He's not an overachiever. He's not a superachiever in that economic setting. He is just like the protagonist in the other plays. He is a modern everyman. He's a middle class stereotype. He's the symbol of someone who is doing well for himself, for his family, and who is also working towards the prosperity of the nation. And that's in that process, getting prosperous himself too, who's thriving under these new economic and socio-political conditions. And he's also someone who reads the right kind of books, has the right kind of literary and aesthetic taste, yeah. And his family also, is quite right. There's a perfection about him which is almost unreal when we contrast it with that of Jerry. So he has the right kind of job, the right number of kids, the average number, as this writer also puts it. And he is a New Yorker, and there is a way in which he blends into that modern landscape. That's where, it's it's a bench in the Central Park in New York City where he spends his Sunday afternoon. It almost looks like a routine, which is true. Very soon we will get to play when you make further progress with the play. He has himself carefully constructed his isolation. Yeah, his isolation. So that this is another difference between the character of Peter and Jerry. Jerry's isolation seems to be forced by many conditions and situations over which he has absolutely no control. But there is something very constructed, very artificial about the isolation that Peter finds himself in. It's not a condition into which he is thrown into. There is a process involved in it. It's part and parcel of the world that he inhabits, the political world, the social world, the material world, his professional world. Yeah? It's part and parcel of the world that he inhabits in order to position himself in the right way, just the way he positions himself in the right side of the bench and has the right kind of preferences and makes the right kind of decisions. This is also a carefully constructed choice, unlike Jerry, who seemed to have received no agency in terms of exercising his choice, yeah, right from his childhood. Peter would prefer not to talk with Jerry, but is too polite and too afraid of anyone's bad opinion, even Jerry's, to ignore him. There also comes in a certain, say, moral compass, which is always at work, even when there is no decision to be made. Peter comes across as that middle class, typical individual who does not confrontational in the least, who does not want to be in the bad books of anyone, even if it is a random person like Jerry who's literally imposing himself upon Peter. He does not want to annoy him. He does not want to, come across as someone who's not polite. Yeah? Once engaged in conversation, he also tries to, have a very superficial, very artificial conversation. But with Jerry, that is entirely not possible. So the reason is that Peter, in fact, is hiding his personality, maybe inadvertently, not just to the world, but also to himself. There is a large part of himself which he covers up quite succinctly, quite carefully, in a very manicured way, with these various choices that he has made. The system, the structure which he inhabits, the structure from which he draws his privileges, also becomes this protective layer which does not allow him, does not where it's easier for him not to expose himself. Jerry, on the other hand, he does not have that covering. That's the only thing, perhaps, separates the one from the other. So when Jerry is asking certain questions which are evidently uncomfortable, initially Peter tries to withdraw from the conversation. Especially, you may recall this instance where they're having this conversation about kids, and Jerry beginning with this very provocative statement, almost an impolite say in a company like that. you're not going to have any more kids, are you? And he becomes furious. Yeah. So Peter, in that sense, he hardly acknowledges his own physicality, and he becomes furious. This defensive nature is out of fear that a stranger might expose him. Yeah. Because deep inside, he has also been longing for one son. And this again, you can find these threads connecting with some aspects of the earlier plays too, where the typical American adult, the American male, wants to have this father-son relationship, which is also, could be situated within the larger ambit of the American dream, where together they pursue this and make things comfortable and secure for the family as well as for the nation. So, in some such obscure, abstract way, we find Peter also longing for a son, but that is not something that he would want to admit to himself. Although Peter, in spite of himself, becomes interested in Jerry's confessions, he's embarrassed by Jerry's candor. So it's a mixture of feelings. Yeah, he is embarrassed when Jerry reveals certain things. So this is how the propriety within societies operate too. One is not always embarrassed by the things that happens to oneself, but also about the things that one encounters. Yeah? The embarrassment which operates in this sense is also emerging out of the larger value system, which by and large has validated and legitimized certain kinds of behavior and certain kinds of manifestations more than the other. So Peter is very clear. It's very clear that Peter throughout the play he prefers to have a shallow conversation. He does not want to go deep, but look at the kind of intimate, private details that Jerry ends up revealing, and the prejudices, the stereotypes that are within Peter. They also come out as and when Jerry is revealing things one after the other. So this uh, and Peter's isolation comes to light only when the conversation proceeds in such way. Yeah, because in a superficial setting there's this facade that he can always use. There's this he can always escape to these little zones of comfort, the prominent zones of comfort that he has built for himself. So if we could just read through this passage, Peter then is self-isolated. His life of things and prejudices protects him from himself and from the world. While it provides no gut pleasures, neither does it allow for gut pain. So this is also another thing, a very bodily thing, a sensual, very sense-oriented thing, which separates Jerry and Peter. Peter's is a kind of middle-class stoicism. But while genuine stoicism raises a man above pleasure and pain, this middle-class variety protects by anesthetizing him in the commonplace. Yeah? He's immune to everything. There's a numbness. Yeah? And this is not the kind of numbness which liberates him. It's not the kind of immunity which liberates him, but it's something which suffocates him, which leaves him isolated, suffocated, which leaves him in this box-like life where he cannot articulate his real self. Again, to think about, if you look back on the other plays that we have discussed, Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, for instance, we find that he's unable to. He thinks he wants to be a salesman, but there are also other things that he longs to do in life. But there are certain choices that he makes out of which he cannot come out there, and he has to employ this stoic approach to life, which he thinks will eventually give him a formula towards success. Yeah? So while Peter is one of the people who is separated from the animal in himself and others, here, as you can see, the human and the animal are used in a very metaphorical sense. The human as something which is covered by nurture, something which is not entirely natural, but the animal within him as this raw natural instinct. So Jerry is an animal. Jerry is what makes Jerry very distinctive in the park and in that entire setting is how comfortable he is with his natural self. He's obviously he is marginalized in so many different ways from his childhood, not just in terms of the family setting, the economic social setting, but also in terms of his body, in terms of his sexuality. He's clearly marginalized, but he is able to acknowledge and he's not in denial of that. Yeah, and which is why there is a separation. He fights separation from the other animals. Yeah, so part of his isolation is forced upon him, and he has absolutely no choice of it, but he's also determined to discover the essential nature of human condition. Yeah, that's very evident in the set of objects that he has as his possessions. They're flawed in some sense, they're incomplete in some sense, they're useless in some sense. Yeah, but they also they could be presented as many metaphors which lead to his life. So, deprived of the usual family relationships, he refuses either to sentimentalize them or to console himself for what he is, with comforting justifications built upon memories of an unhappy childhood. Yeah? So, that is another thing that we noticed over here, that he refuses to sentimentalize any of these tragedies. He has come to terms with it, looks at them in a very matter of fact way, does not it makes an active effort to not let them affect him in any way. But we also find that he's craving for some human contact. He's deprived of human contact. Partly it is imposed upon it. The isolation is largely imposed upon him, but he also wants to come out of it. Yeah, it's not like the careful, manicured, constructed kind of isolation within which Peter seems to be comfortable until this moment of exposition comes his way quite unexpectedly. So, it's at this point, and Jerry at some level is also aware of this fact that there's an impossibility of communication there. Yeah, it's just like, again, the zoo analogy fits in quite well. There's an impossibility of communication, and when one attempts to have a communication, it might lead to chaos and violence, which is what happens at the end of the play too. So this is something, and this the little story, the little tale in between about Jerry and the dog. That's how its relevance could be situated as well. So he tells the story that Jerry tells the story about this dog who always attacks him, tries to attack him when he tries to enter the house. Whenever I came in, but never when I went out. Yeah, it's only when the space of the animal, the pet dog, is intruded into, it tries to attack. So he is trying to blend these elements of symbolism into these natural aspects, yeah, by trying to identify human nature with that of animal nature. He is coming up with these symbols. The player is coming up with these symbols to make sense of this world, make sense of this new economy, which has produced a new set of relationships, which has produced a new set of arrangement within which people like Jerry are outliers who are left out, whose lives end up in such tragedies. So to quickly, this paper, this essay tries to analyze this situation, this tale that Jerry is narrating between the encounter that he has with the dog. The dog considers the house his domain, just as Peter later in the play considers a park bench which he has appropriated as his. Both Peter and the dog are willing to fight to the death any invader of their territories. Yeah. So this is a different kind of a reading altogether that the play is offering to us. Yeah. Here, Peter, middle class, successful, sophisticated gentleman, and the dog, who has very territorial about the space that he occupies, they are equated. Yeah? And who gets, it's not even about what is overtly seen as nature. It's about something deeply inherent, something, this territoriality, this instinct to protect one's territory. That is what is dominating Peter's life, Peter's actions, we can find over here. So, in some sense, Jerry seems to be left out of all of these worlds because he has no territory to claim to. There's no moral territory, there is no economic territory, there's no ideological, political, or a territory value system that he can claim or appropriate. There seems to be no space, real or metaphorical, that he can claim, that he can appropriate as his. On the other hand, a person like Peter, even if it is a park bench, his social standing, the way in which he is placed within these social conditions, that allows him to appropriate that. There is a sense of ownership. He can stake his claims over that space. Yeah, that territoriality is something that comes naturally to him. But here, even in any whichever way one looks at it, if you see a person like Peter and Jerry in this public space, that park bench, you can easily say who belongs there and who is an intruder. Yeah, which is why right from the beginning, even in our vocabulary, in the terms in which we were trying to situate the play, we were always seeing Peter as someone who belonged there. Yeah, that has been his routine, and he's been using the bench, and it's his Sunday afternoon, it's his time, his leisure being spent, and it becomes his space and his territory too. And Jerry, by default, is the one who is intruding into that space, into that physical space, into his mental space, into his privacy, asking about details, while he himself has undergone, he himself has been living this territorialist life, this, spaceless life in some sense since his childhood. He also recalls in this tale with the dog that, how he learned to manipulate the dog, but that's not something that he has been successful in using with people, unfortunately. So Jerry bribes the dog with hamburgers, but this gains him only the tactical advantage of a few extra minutes to race up the stairs before the dog attacks him. Just keep the dog momentarily occupied, just so he can cross over. Look at the precarious nature of this existence. Yeah, and this is something he can't even remotely try out with the other humans with whom he come to contact with. They do not even have, with at least what the play is also trying to tell us is that with the dog, at least there's an engagement, but with another fellow human, even that engagement, which is violent in nature, it's not there. So and maybe that's what forced him to such an ending to at the end of this play, where even if it's violent in nature, even if it's tragic in nature, he's craving for human contact. Something which can result from one human being engaging with another human being, even if there's nothing romantic or nice about it. Because so far, if you look back at his life, based on what he recollects and shares with Peter and the readers, we get to know that there's hardly anything over there which could be romanticized. Yeah, relationships in terms of the natural relationships and the relationships that he tries to have outside of his family, everything is more or less a failure and nothing really comes to fruition. Yeah, and um, um, the empty photo frame is it's a very powerful metaphor, a very powerful symbol in that sense. So in Jerry and the dog, there's an antithetical position that one can identify, and they could be seen as a pair of armed enemies sizing up each other, waiting to spring on or to outmaneuver one another. This is a perfect model of most human relationships as Jerry sees them, which is why he particularly thinks about telling that tale from his eventful life. So there is another contrast that one could see over here. In terms of his material possessions, his life seems to be cluttered but very limited. Yeah, there are these empty and useless things, flawed things. Yeah, very limited. Yeah, things that he could perhaps just put in one bag and walk away. But in terms of, when you look back at his life, yeah, it's so eventful. The kind of tragedies that has befallen him is in an epic scale compared to the neatness which is so very evident in Peter's life. Yeah. So this takes us to this the next question, where Jerry seems to be have seems to have been thinking about some way to establish contact. Yeah, with another person, because towards the end of the play, he also leaves. He throws he throws this open-ended question. Did I plan all of these? Maybe I did. Yeah. So in this, you can find a lot of insight in what he shares halfway through the play, right after he tells in detail his tale between his encounter with the dog. I have learned that neither kindness or cruelty, independent of each other, creates any effect beyond themselves, and I have learned that the two combined together at the same time are the teaching emotion. One must reach into the realm where emotions themselves are not sharply differentiated, but as Jerry explains, even the flash of understanding that can result from such a contact gives no assurance that the contact can endure for more than an instant. In Jerry's words, and what is gained is loss. What has been is the result. The dog and I have attained a compromise, more of a bargain. We neither love or hurt each other because we do not try to reach each other. That sort of symbolizes, that sort of, perfectly sums up the kind of relationship that different people from, across these social strata have with each other. Um, there's something very unusual which happens over here. Jerry tries to tickle Peter, realizing that he cannot be drawn out of his shell. He's it's a carefully constructed shell which has also grown onto him, which has become perhaps part of his body itself over the last many years. So what Jerry tries to do is he begins by tickling Peter. This is something which is considered entirely inappropriate within the social within the norms of social propriety. Tickling, he begins by tickling Peter. Tickling, being a pleasure pain experience, perfectly implements Jerry's theory that the teaching emotion involves cruelty and kindness combined. It must perforce elicit a primitive animal response. The effect upon Peter of the tickling is startling and immediate. It enables him for the first time to relax his grip upon the shield that his perfect life provides. So he begins to loosen up with some contact. Yeah. So here we find that more than Jerry, perhaps Peter had also been longing for this kind of a contact, which will help him break out of his shell. Something that the society that he is part of cannot provide. Something the society that he's part of cannot reach out to him in such ways. Yeah. If we could take a look at this incident from the play, which you must be familiar with too. Oh, he, I must go. After all, stop, stop. After all, the parakeets will be getting dinner ready soon, and the cats are setting the table. Stop, and we're having. Jerry stops tickling Peter, but the combination of the tickling and his own mad whimsy has Peter laughing almost hysterically. As his laughter continues, then subsides, Jerry watches him with a curious, fixed smile. Peter goes on laughing, and Jerry reminds him that something has happened at the zoo about which Peter is curious. Yeah, well, I had my own zoo there for a moment with oh my, I don't know what happened to me. So this is, this teaching moment is very liberating for Peter, and he is also, able to see uh, the emptiness of his life. He's going back to the cats, the children, wife, parakeets, and they are all like, they're all mere props. He realizes the way he's talking about it, that sentence, when he's getting tickled and he has no grip over himself. Yeah, dinner is getting ready soon. The parakeets will be getting ready soon. Cats are setting up the table. So these figures in his life, the human and the pet figures in his life, they're all interchangeable. It really does not make a difference, and they're all mere props whose function, as this essay also elicits, is to disguise nothingness and isolation. Yeah. So it's difficult to say whose tragedy is worse. One is more visible, one is more tangible, the other is very carefully protected, and one could perhaps live an entire lifetime without ever getting into touch with that reality, but living this hollow life, which does not, which is very deeply engraved in its isolation. So this essay picks up these various instances from the text and teaches us how to read it critically. We will skip to this session where it talks about where Jerry is being identified as Jesus, and look at that that brief exchange between the landlady and Jerry. The landlady asks him to pray for the sick dog. Yeah, so Jerry replies, "Madam, I have myself to pray for: the colored queen, the Puerto Rican family, the person whom I have never seen, the woman who cries behind the closed door, and the rest of the people in all the rooming houses everywhere." So here he comes across as this modern Messiah who takes responsibility for all these other characters who are equally isolated like him, who are in an equally tragic condition such as his own. So he refuses to engage with the landlady when the landlady requests him to pray for the sick dog. Yeah, he takes upon this larger responsibility like a modern Messiah and makes it very clear what his priorities are. So this also helps us to see Jerry in a different light altogether, the kind of accountability that he seems to be having for his fellow humans, which is something clearly missing in a person. So this is the kind of prioritizing, this is a kind of response perhaps someone like Peter cannot even think of, cannot even comprehend. So this essay also encourages us to extend this biblical allegory, these biblical symbols, and to see where this takes us. Yeah. So here, if we are looking at the tale of Jerry and the dog as a parable, yeah, and it makes a lot of sense, in terms of the moral that he's trying to convey, in terms of the situations that he is trying to explicate, and even that his act of taking the subway to the village so that he could walk all the way up the Fifth Avenue to the zoo. Despite the Sisyphean nature of it, what one could also see is this journey, the journey that Christ took, the journey downtown and up, at the end of which lies the salvation of a man. Of course, Christ descent into hell and resurrection, which are necessary before the redemption can begin. So here is Jerry, who assumes the persona of a modern Messiah in terms of locating his priorities, in terms of preparing himself before the final redemption. Yeah? But this is sacrilegious to a person like Peter. He does not engage with that at all. Yeah. So when Jerry is persisting him, Peter, tell me what you think. I don't understand what I don't think. Why did you tell me all of this? Yeah. He wants to be in denial. Yeah. He deliberately resists understanding, and then he pretends that he hasn't understood it at all. Yeah. Why not? I don't understand. That's a lie. No, no, it's not. I tried to explain to you as I went along. I went slowly. It all has nothing to do with I don't want to hear anymore. So Jerry's parable, like the Gospels, is spoken slowly and framed in the simplest terms. But like the Gospels, it is rejected by every man who pretends not to understand, who pleads confusion, and who finally flees from the responsibility that understanding would demand. Jerry's truth cannot be conveyed in words. Yeah. So which is why, yeah, just in very biblical terms, again, there are a series of teachings which is rejected by the everyman in that situation. But eventually it leads to this action of redemption, only through which, yeah, people like Peter can perhaps escape from the self-isolation. So here the figure of Jerry becoming the sacrificial figure that becomes more and more evident towards the end of the play. So here, we find that, Jerry tries his best to convey through his words, and he realizes that it's entirely lost on Peter, maybe because of the different worlds that they inhabit, and it leads to this inevitable ending. So towards the end of the play, we realize that Jerry actually dies for Peter. Yeah? So the tragedy is more accentuated. Yeah, there's a lot of tenderness in this story. In some sense, it's very violent, but it's also, the tragedy is also very tender over here. He dies to save Peter's soul from death by spiritual starvation, yeah, so to speak. Yeah, it's very metaphorical over here. And Jerry realizes that there's no way in which Peter could be woken up out of his denial, or Peter could be, made to come to, begin to address his self isolation until something like this happens. Peter will be forced by Jerry's death to know himself and to feel kinship with the outcast for whom Jerry has prayed. Yeah? So, this is the intention towards the end of the play, to try and bridge this divide, while this bridging becomes almost impossible through words, through the stories that they try to share. And Jerry goes out of his way to share the intimate details, share some immediate details, a lot of metaphorical stories, and what happened to his life. And he craves for human contact, that is one thing, but he also wants to bridge this divide that entirely falls flat, and he is becomes a sacrificial lamb over there, just so Peter would begin to uh, identify with him. Peter would begin to feel kinship with the likes of Jerry. Yeah. So there's a completion over here in terms of the prayer that he articulates, the kind of prayer that he says he would want to pray, and this ending. Yeah. So in the dialogue of the death scene, Albie makes his allusions very broad. In the instant before Jerry decides to impale himself upon the knife, this is how the death happens. He's impaling himself upon the knife. There's absolutely no way in which Peter becomes a murderer over here. There is death, but it is neither a suicide nor a murder. It's more like a sacrifice over here. There's a suggestion of a momentary decision followed by acceptance, and this he articulates well too. Peter says, I'll give you one last chance to get out of here and leave me alone. He holds a knife with a firm hand, but far in front of him, not to attack, but to defend. Yeah. So, what makes these tragedies more uh, I know tender is the fact that there are no bad people over here. The same applies in most of the other plays that we have read through as well. There are no villainous figures over here. They're all victims of particular circumstances, and the circumstances seem to be governed by a single overarching economic ambition. Um, Jerry, so be it. This decision to accept death for man's salvation. Yeah, so this is also an essay which tries to see this the biblical image coming to life in these articulations. Yeah. So in well, this is something, just going through the final scene, yeah, where the Jerry's death happens. Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh my God! Peter is obviously completely terrified of what has happened. Jerry is dying, but now his expression seems to change. His features relax, and while his voice varies, sometimes wrenched with pain, for the most part, he seems removed from his dying. Thank you, Peter. I mean that now. Thank you very much. I come unto you, and you have comforted me, dear Peter. Oh my God, because this is perhaps, the only human being who had listened to his life story. Yeah? In these few, we don't get a sense of the time which has passed during this their encounter, but in this Sunday afternoon, yeah, during this encounter, maybe it's for the first time that Jerry got a listener, who could listen to the where he could pour out his life story from his childhood, what happened to his childhood till the the recent incident with the dog, and also to articulate his philosophical take on these different conditions, human behavior, and how he identifies the human condition with the zoo. So this, it's very fulfilling for him, and this perhaps is an act of redemption which he does for himself and also for the likes of Peter. You'd better go now. Somebody might come by, and you don't want to be here when anyone comes. Peter does not move, but he begins to weep. Jerry, his eyes still closed, he shakes his head and speaks a combination of scornful and mimicry and supplication. Oh my God, yeah. So this is there's a repetition of the phrase over here, and there is a kind of an awareness which is hopefully beginning to grow in Peter's mind, and there's a sense of peace which settles down on Jerry's life too. And here. Um, and here, if again the essay is also bringing in another biblical allegory over here where Peter denies Jesus. Yeah. So here, in the same way, he's forced to go away. Yeah. Here, the modern messianic figure of Jerry is forcing Peter to go away from the scene, lest he gets implicated in the crime. Yeah. So what, in some sense, it's possible to argue, like this essay does, that Albee has written a morality play over here. Yeah, in the 1950s. Through a morality play, he is trying to critique the socioeconomic conditions of those times. How it's about human isolation and salvation through sacrifice. Yeah, and this there's something very uh, ancient about this theme, and this is how the naturalist elements come in very handy while critiquing a very modern setting, a modern economic system, a modern social system. This perhaps is only just one way with which we can look at this play. This is again like most of the other plays that we have read through. These are the plays which would lend themselves to multiple approaches, and you can come and critique them, come and interpret them through various ways. Yeah. So here, the element of sacrifice, the sacrificial element at the end of it, makes this gives this play a very different flavor. The end becomes, it's neither death nor murder. It's not the death here. The death is neither suicide nor murder. It becomes a sacrifice, and it becomes a redemptive activity. It becomes a service that Jerry is offering to the to his fellow humans, which includes everyone in the zoo, everyone across these different social strata. So zoo here becomes an entry point into this conversation, an entry point into this discussion. Zoo here becomes a metaphor which will help us open up the compartmentalized ways in which relationships and different social structures are kept in either in difference or in alignment with each other. So with this, we come to the end of this play. We will we will perhaps take one last look at the major themes which are which have defined this play, and then move on to discussing the next work. So thank you all for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.